In 1997, a mining crew breaking through a collapsed tunnel wall in eastern Siberia found something that stopped them cold. Wedged into the rock face, half buried in permafrost and coal dust, sat the rusted hulk of a steam locomotive. It wore German markings. Soviet records insisted no German locomotives had ever operated this far east. The machine itself seemed purpose-built for war. Armor plating on the boiler, gun mounts on the tender, reinforced pilot beams meant to ram through obstacles. But the strangest detail was painted on its cab, a red star, the symbol of the Soviet Union, layered over faded Wehrmacht crosses. For 3 years, the locomotive sat in that tunnel, while historians and railway archaeologists argued about what it was. Some claimed it was a captured German war engine shipped east during the chaos of 1945. Others insisted it was a Soviet clone, reverse-engineered from German designs. A few believed it was something else entirely, a machine that revealed a secret chapter in the industrial warfare that defined the Eastern Front, a chapter where the line between enemy and ally blurred in the mud and blood of total war. The truth turned out to be far stranger than any of those theories. To understand what that locomotive was doing in a Siberian coal mine, you have to go back to 1941, to the moment when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and Stalin's industrial empire faced extinction. Within 6 months, the Wehrmacht had captured or destroyed over half of Soviet locomotive production capacity. The rolling stock losses were catastrophic. Thousands of engines either blown up by retreating Soviet forces or seized by advancing Germans. In the Trans-Siberian Railway, that lifeline connecting European Russia to the resource-rich East, was operating on fumes. Without locomotives, the war effort would collapse. Tanks couldn't move without fuel. Factories couldn't run without coal. Armies couldn't eat without grain shipments. Stalin's solution was as brutal as it was pragmatic. Take everything from the captured territories that could be used. In the winter of 1943, after the tide turned at Stalingrad, Soviet forces began a systematic salvage operation. Every rail yard they recaptured became a sorting ground. German locomotives in working condition were immediately pressed into Red Army service. Damaged German engines were cannibalized for parts or shipped east to be rebuilt. But the most interesting machines were the Kriegslokomotiven, the war locomotives. When the Kriegslok was Germany's answer to the same problem the Soviets faced, how to build a locomotive that could survive warfare. Designed in 1942 by a consortium of German manufacturers, the Kriegslok stripped away every luxury and focused on one goal: keep moving no matter what. They used lower-grade steel to save strategic materials. They simplified the valve gear. They eliminated unnecessary fittings, but they also armored critical components, reinforced wheel sets to handle bombed-out track, and designed the boiler to operate on whatever fuel was available: coal, wood, peat, even lignite. By 1943, over 6,000 Kriegsloks were operating across occupied Europe. They were ugly, uncomfortable, and incredibly tough. Soviet engineers immediately recognized their value. And these were machines built for exactly the conditions they were facing: irregular fuel supplies, damaged infrastructure, constant threat of attack. But the Soviets wanted to go further. In late 1943, a special engineering brigade was assembled at a captured rail works in the western Ukraine. Their orders came directly from the State Defense Committee: analyze the captured Kriegsloks, identify weaknesses, and create an improved version. This wasn't just about copying German technology. It was about understanding what made these machines work under impossible conditions and then making them better. The chief engineer was a man named Mikhail Yegorov, a veteran of the pre-war locomotive works at Kolomna. Yegorov had spent 2 years designing engines for the Trans-Siberian Railway, machines meant to handle extreme cold and vast distances. Now he was looking at German locomotives built for combat in the forests and steppes of the East. He saw immediately what needed to change. The German Kriegslok used a simplified 2-cylinder design to reduce maintenance. Fewer moving parts meant fewer things to break, but it also meant lower power output. Yegorov proposed adding a 3rd cylinder and adopting a compound expansion system, high-pressure steam in the center cylinder, then exhausting into 2 low-pressure cylinders on the sides. This would extract more work from the same amount of fuel, critical when operating in regions where coal supplies were unreliable. The German design protected the boiler with armor plating, but left the running gear exposed. Yegorov added armored skirting that protected the motion from rifle fire and shrapnel while still allowing maintenance access. The tender was redesigned to carry not just coal and water, but also ammunition and supplies for frontline operations. Gun mounts were integrated into the frame, though whether they were ever actually armed remains disputed. By spring 1944, the first prototype was ready. It was designated the E-Series, though Soviet records used multiple names, E1, EL, and even Trofei, or Trophy. The locomotive was tested on the recently liberated sections of track west of Bryansk, hauling supply trains through territory, still subject to partisan attacks and occasional German counterstrikes. The results exceeded expectations. The compound expansion system delivered nearly 30% more tractive effort than the German Kriegslok, while consuming the same amount of fuel. The armored skirting proved its worth when a partisan attack, unclear whether it was anti-Soviet or anti-German partisans, hit a supply convoy. Small arms fire damaged the locomotive's piping and shattered gauges, but the protected running gear kept functioning. The train limped to the next depot and was back in service within 18 hours. Between April 1944 and January 1945, approximately 90 of these hybrid war locomotives were built. They operated exclusively in the most dangerous zones, the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and the territories of eastern Prussia, as Soviet forces pushed into Germany itself. Their armor and robust construction made them ideal for the chaos of the front lines, where rail infrastructure was constantly being damaged and repaired, where fuel quality varied wildly, where attacks could come from any direction. But there was a problem. These locomotives were industrial chimeras, German frames with Soviet boilers, captured components mixed with improvised solutions, built in factories that kept incomplete records because they were still under artillery fire when the work was being done. After the war, when the Red Army's logistics apparatus began the massive task of cataloging and standardizing its rolling stock, the E-Series locomotives became an administrative nightmare. They didn't fit into any standard classification. Parts were a mix of metric and Soviet measurements. Maintenance procedures were improvised. The solution was simple and ruthless: remove them from service. By late 1946, most of the E-Series locomotives had been pulled from active duty. Some were scrapped immediately. and others were sent to remote regions where standardization mattered less than having any locomotive at all. A handful ended up in Siberia, assigned to mining operations, where they would haul coal from pit to railhead, far from the scrutiny of central planners. The locomotive found in that Siberian mine in 1997 was one of these exiles. Records eventually revealed it had arrived at the Urgal coal basin in 1947, one of 3 E-series engines assigned to supplement the aging Soviet locomotives already working the mines. It operated for about 5 years, hauling coal through tunnels barely wide enough for its armored bulk. Then, in 1952, a tunnel collapse during a particularly harsh winter trapped the locomotive underground. The mine was considered exhausted anyway. It was easier to seal the tunnel and write off the engine than to mount a recovery operation. For 45 years it sat in the dark, slowly rusting, gradually being buried by rockfalls and coal dust. When the mining crew broke through in 1997, they found a ghost from a war most of them knew only from history books, the red star painted over German crosses, the compound cylinders and armored skirting, the improvised details that spoke of desperate engineering done under combat conditions. The locomotive was eventually extracted and moved to a rail museum in Khabarovsk, where it remains today. Restoration work has been minimal. Corrosion had eaten through much of the plating, and the internal mechanisms were seized beyond economical repair. But even as a static display, the machine tells a story that challenges simple narratives about the Second World War. This wasn't just a captured German locomotive. It wasn't just a Soviet copy. It was something created in that narrow window when survival mattered more than ideology, when engineers took whatever worked and made it better, when the distinction between ours and theirs dissolved in the face of immediate necessity. For a brief period, in desperate conditions, form followed function in its purest sense. How many other machines like this existed? How many other hybrid solutions were created in the chaos of total war, and then deliberately erased from records because they didn't fit neat categories? The Siberian mine locomotive is the only confirmed example we have. But Soviet railway records from 1944 to 1946 contain gaps and inconsistencies that suggest it wasn't alone. In the end, this locomotive's greatest achievement wasn't its improved efficiency or its combat resilience. It was surviving long enough to remind us that war produces not just destruction, but also strange moments of innovation, moments when the usual rules don't apply, when brilliance emerges from desperation, and when the line between enemy technology and Allied improvement becomes meaningless in the face of shared problems. The machine sits in Khabarovsk now, slowly continuing its rust and decay. Visitors walk past, often without understanding what they're looking at. Those who do notice tend to focus on the obvious: the German heritage, the Soviet modifications, the armor and gun mounts. But the real story is in the details. The compound cylinders that squeezed extra power from low-grade coal, the improvised skirting that protected vulnerable components, the tender redesign to carry ammunition alongside water. These are the marks of engineers who understood that surviving a war required more than just copying what worked. It required making it better.